Let's see where we go and what we do. I'd like perhaps invite you to come back to Thursday afternoon as we arrived. And perhaps if you could hit the pause button for all those angels that are dancing in your mind and go back to your impressions as you arrived here on Thursday. As you came into the grounds of the school, as you entered into the reception and registration area, peeked inside the auditorium to see how it was set up, how creative were we going to be, how touchy-feely were we perhaps going to be, would we be safe in that space? Perhaps if you could call to mind some of your own hopes, what you were hoping to take away at the end of this time, and perhaps what you were concerned might disappoint. I guess if I was looking for one word to summarize where I'm at right now, it's simply gratitude. Gratitude for an amazing weekend. Let me start with the poets and the musicians and the dramatists, the actors, and of course the other forms of artists, both the visual and the verbal artistry that we've enjoyed. That's actually been the troubadour tradition, we might call it, has been part of the Common Dreams process from the beginning. We always aspired to kind of doing some of the processing of the information overload. You know, we all have this sense of wanting to put our head on the side and empty it out a bit. It's always been part of our tradition, and we have been mightily served by a most amazing bunch of actors and musicians and so on, several of whom are over there. They've helped us to explore ways that we might sing the Lord's song in a land which is not foreign to us and is not as strange to us, if only we will listen to the people who have been here and who have called this place home for so long. So thank you to the troubadours, to the artists, to the musicians, to the singers who have drawn us into the process of singing the song of grace, the song of mystery. We've been very conscious of being on country. We may be on unfamiliar ground. I certainly am whenever I come to Sydney, but that's because I'm an Anglican from somewhere else. This really is Nakar, a foreign and strange place to a simple Bible scholar from the North Coast. But we were made welcome to this country, and we responded repeatedly and I think authentically and sincerely by acknowledging the ancient ownership of this land. Always was, always is, always will be Aboriginal land. And Matthew, I've probably got this much time to summarise a response to Matthew's amazing contributions. Such a seminal thinker, a seed planter, indeed a dangerous person. I'm sure Ratzinger was absolutely correct in his identification that you would cause problems if he didn't deal with you. He just chose the wrong strategy. Instead of learning from you, he tried to silence you. I almost wish Anglicans had a way of silencing troublesome cathedral deans for 12 months. That sabbatical idea would be really interesting, but I suspect it was hard work and a joyful year as well. Listening to creation as we learn how to sing that song. But you mix that invitation with a sense of urgency. But even as we heard just in the last few minutes, and I kept adding more notes to my handful of comments here, even in the last answers to the last couple of questions, there's urgency, but there's hope. And there's playfulness and there's joy, and that's so good. You've sketched some of the rich possibilities for renewal and recovery, and you've called us to be mystical warriors, people who are in touch with the mystical side of ourselves and of the cosmos, indeed, but at the same time, people of courage and people of action. And you've repeatedly called us back to walk those four paths and not simply to stay on the road more travelled. Norman Hayward, I'm sure Norman is in the room right at the moment, but has been one of my heroes for a long time. And he's, of course, called us again in his gentle and attentive, with that attentive eye for detail, called us to be attentive to text. But he's a text scholar who calls us to be attentive to place. The place that is described in the scriptures, but also the place where we are, and attentive to the custodians of those places. He has listened to the elders of this ancient land, and he has become an elder to whom we listen as well. And we saw some of his wisdom and his leadership, and indeed his good grace, as he sat through not one but two workshops while we haggled over his words and suggested where the commas should be and which was the right word to use at this point. Thankfully, we weren't writing the Pentateuch, we were just writing the Common Dreams statement. Rod Bauer, we've all seen and heard so much of Rod these last few years, and I've come to think of him as Mr. Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, depending on the spiritual tradition you grew up in. Mr. Habakkuk. In Habakkuk, in the English versification, chapter 2, verse 2, we find, and I'll do the more traditional NRSV first, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it. And I was hunting around on my Bible software last night for a slightly more evocative translation. If you look far enough, like interpretations, you can find a translation to suit your prejudice. So I went to the Message, which is not a place you'll often find me, but I went to the Message, and so Eugene Peterson expressed it this way, which I like, so I'm going to use it like everything else that I choose to use. I think this is an ancient Hebrew prophecy of the troublesome priest at Gosford Anglican Parish. Write this, write what you see, write it out in big block letters. So that it can be read on the run, which I'm sure means the traffic going past, not the rector fleeing from the heresy trial. So we thank Rod for all the ways in which he is one of our prophets, and for the incredible exposition of his own journey and of the Good Samaritan. Actually, it's the Samaritan. We always add the word good as if that's somehow necessary. It's simply the parable of the Samaritan. Jonathan, wish there were more of you here, or more of you as well, but even more from the Jewish community. What a gift to have grown up in a progressive faith community, grounded in Scripture and all the tradition around Scripture, but also so engaged, so connected with the world, and just knowing, even I think from your childhood, that it was okay to push the boundaries and to explore. What a gift your faith and your community has been to you. Calling us to action in the real world, calling us beyond belief, beyond the words in which those beliefs have so often been expressed and defended, calling us to practical wisdom as we engage in the healing of the world. Tikkun olam, indeed, moed, may it be so. And reminding us as well of that that universal wisdom which finds expression, as we would expect it to do, in more than one tradition. And we had screen after screen after screen of powerful pieces of spiritual wisdom. I want to thank those who agreed to serve on the Q&A panel. And I hope that process helped us to, all of us, to kind of sharpen our focus on the questions. And I've just realised maybe I left out one of the most important things I wanted to say. No, I must have put it at the end. Okay, we'll come to it. And again, we had just a brief summary a moment ago from Matthew. It's about taking creation seriously. It's about respecting and learning attentively from the Aboriginal custodians, who are custodians not only of the land, but of the ancient wisdom which humans have discovered and fashioned in this land. We've come back again, just in the last hour or so, to reflecting on the crisis of God talk, whether that was in Margaret's presentation or again some of the questions and discussion just now, speaking of God, singing the Lord's song, as the psalm reminds us, after the crisis, on this side of the flood. About becoming responsible humans, responsible humanity, who don't need a God to rescue us from ourselves, but are glad to have a God who calls us into God's own dream. And of course, the need for us, as we reflected on this through the Micah passage, the need for us to do that with humility, with gentleness, without inflicting our prejudices on others, and praying for wisdom as we go into the debate which is breaking all around us in Australia, at least at the moment, and I suspect is washing up on the shores of Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. Ro gave us an amazing presentation yesterday, reminding us that yes, the ancient Jewish texts, which are also our texts, Christian texts, speak of creation as male and female, and we can add, and then some. I had occasion at the Synod of the Diocese of Grafton recently, as we were surprisingly debating a motion affirming God's hospitality, or our hospitality, to all God's people. And we had speaker after speaker opposed to the motion, because Liberals and Progressives are not very good at organising ourselves to have a speakers list after we've thought about the mover and the seconder, dragging out all the things. We had pedophilia, we had the whole works. Then I slipped off my chain briefly and called the Synod back to appreciate both the stories in Genesis, and that male and female is not the outer limits, it's simply an ancient Hebrew way of saying totality, heaven and earth and sky, male and female, and so on, land and sea. So the work that Ro is doing in Victoria should mean that a whole lot of us shift south perhaps, or perhaps we just take inspiration to be faithful in our own place. Yes, challenges remain. She's obviously addressing them with humour, and that's something we find in their work, but also reminding us that if we're confident in our own skins and in our own spirituality, we can laugh at ourselves even in the most difficult times. We have a whole list of people who presented workshops, and of course we each only got to go to 2 of them, I obviously, like you, only experienced 2 of those long lists of sessions. But our thanks to the presenters, our thanks to those who served as moderators, as we had opportunities to follow our passion, to dream and to scheme. And I hope that we've done some dreaming and some scheming. The film which Robin both introduced and then helped us to reflect on afterwards, of course, addressed some of our jealousy of those well-funded large American churches that just seem to have so much going for them, and reminded us it's about being faithful where we are and making the steps one journey at a time, making the journey one step at a time, and that faithfulness is what we're called to. And by that faithfulness, by that trust, we will find life. Anne had to slip away just before. It's like she's not going to hear me being nice to her, but she would expect nothing less. Anne, of course, comes across because she is a person of integrity. She's a person of character. And indeed, of course, Anne is a person of courage. Again, a key word in the last hour or so as we've thought about courage. Wisdom birthed through hardship. A hardship which is both personal, individual if you like, but also collective. Hardship which has befallen her people and her land. And an invitation out of her immense generosity, notwithstanding her passion and her fear that she might be too bold and too confrontational, not telling us to go to hell, but as someone else has been doing recently, but inviting us to stand with her and to make the journey with her. And I hope we do. Margaret spoke quietly and gently, as always, inviting us and naming the fact that she, like us, is facing the darkness, but reminding us that we can hold to the dream and that we can at least bear witness to the dream while refusing the simple solutions, in inverted commas, and that we do this best in community. As people of the way, we're not solo travellers, but we're forming communities of practice which help us to be places and people of hope and of witness and action. As particularly towards the end of Margaret's presentation, I found myself reflecting on that ancient aphorism about the splinter and log, and the danger that the log in our own eye can sometimes blind us to the splinter that's obviously afflicting somebody else. And that need for grace and humility and courage, again, coming out. In this conference, unlike perhaps most of the earlier Common Dreams events, Val was not a headline speaker, but she has been right in there amongst it all, in all kinds of levels, and we saw that especially in the last couple of hours as she engaged herself directly with Matthew and then assisted us all to engage in that dialogue, and in doing so again helped us to be served up yet another round of Matthew's wisdom. So thank you, Val, for what you were doing and for that teasing out of some of Matthew's own experience. Various folk have commented, particularly those who have been around Common Dreams for a while, have commented that it has seemed a little bit different this time. And Margaret alluded to that as well at the beginning of her presentation, that the planning committee, of which have not been a part this time around, but the planning committee was particularly keen to avoid, how do you describe it, intellectual entertainment, and that pleasant feeling of progressive spiritual superiority to our benighted conservative and evangelical siblings, which we have to get over and which we have to, of course, move beyond. And because I think one of the reasons this conference might have felt a bit different to us is because we were not so much focused on in the internal needs of different Christian communities and our own ongoing therapy as we come to terms with our own Christian inheritance and legacy, But my sense was that in this particular gathering, we have been much more preoccupied with the issues of the wider society, and so we should be. So we've focused on the environment, the land, the place, the whole of creation. We've thought, perhaps not long, but we've thought hard and with eyes wide open about the impacts of climate change and what kind of world we may yet find the wit and the wisdom to fashion. The conference has fallen entirely within NAIDOC week, and so we have been attentive to the issues of the First Peoples, to voice, to treaty, and to truth-telling. And as we take the Common Dream statement back to our faith communities, I have parish council on Wednesday nights, so guess what's being added to the agenda? Okay, we will have opportunities to engage with the processes around voice, treaty, and truth-telling. We've engaged, I think, in a more direct way than in earlier conversations, gatherings, with gender diversity, and that is indeed one of the major flashpoints in the kind of culture war which is upon us in the broader society. And of course, related to that, and as a kind of cipher for that, unfortunately, are the debates about religious freedom and about the right to discriminate on the basis of religion, and how we might navigate our way to a servant faith rather than a dominant faith. And the whole process, I think, has been much more experiential. We've not only been entertained by the troubadours, if we can call them that, we've also been drawn into song. We've been drawn into the dramatic moments. We've been engaged in all of that, perhaps in ways that we have not managed so well in previous times. So it's been a fantastic few days, much to learn, no doubt, and much yet to improve. But I want to say thank you to everybody, and kind of thank you to Dick, who I notice has come down the front, for ringing up and saying, David Felton can't be here, but what about you do the wrap-up at the end? So thank you for the trust and the privilege of that moment. Thank you.